Women don't belong in combat. You can train, you can fly, but you will never fight. Colonel Harding's voice thundered, echoing across the room. For 2 long years, Captain Mara Kessler carried those words like chains around her neck. Every denied mission a reminder of a system that refused to see her worth. But then, everything changed. 20 soldiers, trapped in a valley, surrounded by hundreds of enemy fighters. Their desperate calls echoed across the radio. Any aircraft, we're going to die out here. And then, one voice answered. Mara's hands gripped the controls. A pilot once forbidden from combat looked at her Apache and broke the rule that had caged her for years. In that moment, she wasn't just flying into battle, she was flying into history. The rotors of the AH-64 Apache stirred the desert air, but for Captain Mara Kessler, the sound had long since become a kind of cruel lullaby. She had logged over 450 hours in this machine, mastering every system, every emergency drill, every precision strike simulation. Her instructors had praised her as one of the sharpest minds in her class, a pilot whose weapon scores consistently landed in the top percentile. And yet, every time the call came for combat missions, her name was crossed off the roster. The reason was never technical, never about skill. It was always policy. At the head of that policy stood Colonel Harding, a man with deep lines etched into his face from decades of command, and an even deeper conviction that women had no place in the crucible of direct combat. His words, sharp and unyielding, were still fresh in Mara's memory. Women don't belong in combat. You can train, you can fly, but you will never fight. Harding's voice carried the weight of the old guard, a philosophy built on tradition rather than evidence. He did not see Mara's performance on the flight simulators, nor her flawless execution in live-fire training, as proof of capability. To him, she was simply an outlier, an exception that didn't deserve to challenge the rule. And for Mara, each denied mission order felt like another invisible chain wrapping around her, pulling tighter, reminding her that no matter how skilled she was, the system had already decided her limits. She carried those chains into every dawn patrol and every reconnaissance assignment. Instead of unleashing the Apache's arsenal, she hovered on the sidelines, her role reduced to eyes in the sky. She was tasked with scanning borders, reporting movements, filing intelligence. Work that mattered, yes, but never the test she had trained for. To Mara, it felt like being handed the blade of a sword and then told to never draw it. Her co-pilot, Chief Warrant Officer Daniel Ortiz, had seen enough wars to fill a lifetime. 3 tours, dozens of firefights, the scars of both shrapnel and memory. When he was first paired with Mara, he had folded his arms and muttered to another pilot, "Another experiment. Let's see how long this one lasts." He didn't mean it cruelly. It was the resignation of a soldier who had been told by the chain of command that women couldn't carry the burden. But as months passed, Ortiz found himself watching Mara in the cockpit with a growing respect. Her hands were steady on the cyclic, her commands crisp, her situational awareness razor sharp. During training runs, she could identify threats faster than most pilots he had flown with. He would never admit it out loud in those early days, but part of him began to wonder if Harding had been wrong. Still, Ortiz knew better than to challenge the colonel. Rules were rules. And in the military, breaking rules often meant ending a career. So he said little, keeping his doubts tucked behind a mask of professionalism. Mara fought a hidden battle of patience and endurance. Every dismissal became fuel, every limited sortie a chance to sharpen her skill, a quiet protest against the ceiling above her. She told herself that when the skies demanded more than reconnaissance, she would be ready. For her, readiness meant proving that courage and sacrifice had no gender, and that silenced voices would one day be impossible to ignore. Colonel Harding may have believed she was unfit for combat. Ortiz may have carried his doubts. But in the quiet rhythm of the flight line, beneath the rising Afghan sun, Captain Mara Kessler strapped into her Apache each day with a simple vow echoing in her chest. When the call comes, I will not hesitate. And though she could not yet see it, the call was already on its way, carried on the wind of a valley not far from where she sat, where 20 soldiers would soon cry out for help. The morning sky stretched pale blue over the jagged ridges as Captain Mara Kessler lifted her Apache into the air. The desert floor blurred beneath them, Scattered villages and winding dry riverbeds reduced to shapes on the tactical display. Next to her, Chief Warrant Officer Daniel Ortiz ran through the familiar checklist, his voice steady, his tone routine. It was on paper just another patrol. Their route had been carefully drawn to avoid trouble. Long sweeps near the border, observation of mountain passes, intelligence gathering. The orders had been clear: no direct combat engagement. Report movements, monitor comms, but under no circumstances cross the line into unauthorized action. For Mara, the monotony was suffocating. She felt like a watchdog on a leash, flying one of the most lethal machines on Earth, but forbidden to unsheath its claws. Ortiz sensed her frustration. He'd flown with her long enough to recognize the tension in her shoulders. But like her, he knew the risk of breaking the rules. And then the radio crackled. At first, it was just background noise, scattered transmissions from nearby units. But then a voice cut through, jagged and desperate, riding the static with unmistakable urgency. Any aircraft, any aircraft. This is Bravo Company. We are surrounded. Heavy casualties, ammunition nearly gone. Request immediate close air support. I repeat, we are going to die out here. The words froze the cockpit. Ortiz turned toward Mara, his eyes narrowing. He checked the coordinates flashing on the screen. 15 kilometers east, he muttered. They're pinned in a valley. That's outside our patrol area. Mara stared at the map. The valley was a textbook kill zone. High ridges on three sides, perfect for enemy fighters to rain fire on anyone trapped below. Bravo Company had walked into a nightmare. She tightened her grip on the controls. How long for command to clear support? Ortiz shook his head. Minimum 30 minutes, maybe longer, given... He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. They both knew what given meant. Given that Mara was a woman. Given that Harding's rules forbade her from combat. The radio voice came again, louder this time, cracking under the weight of fear. We're surrounded by at least 200 enemy fighters. We cannot hold. Please, any aircraft, respond. Ortiz's voice dropped low. Mara, if we go, it's a direct violation. Harding will end both our careers. Her heart hammered. For 2 years, she had lived under those words, chained by orders that denied her the very role she had trained for. But now, 20 American soldiers were bleeding in a valley, seconds from annihilation. She glanced at Ortiz. And if we don't? Those men are dead within 10 minutes. The cockpit fell silent except for the steady hum of the rotors. This was the moment. The clash between orders and conscience. Between loyalty to the system and loyalty to the men on the ground. Mara's jaw tightened. Sometimes saving lives means breaking rules. Ortiz studied her for a long beat. Then he armed the weapons system with a click. If we're going down for this, we go down together. Mara banked the Apache hard, turning toward the valley. The machine responded like it had been waiting years for this exact command. History is full of moments when rules said no, but humanity demanded yes. In Vietnam and World War II, soldiers often broke orders to save lives, risking careers to protect their brothers. Mara's choice placed her in that same lineage, not for glory, but because the math was simple. 20 lives against one career. And in war, sometimes survival is the only equation that matters. As the Apache roared toward the valley, the world outside blurred into streaks of sand and shadow. Mara felt every denied mission, every dismissal, every time Harding's voice had told her she would never fight. And now she was fighting, not for recognition, not for defiance, but for 20 soldiers praying into a radio for someone, anyone, to hear them. Bravo Company, she said, her voice cutting through the static as her thumb pressed the comm switch. This is Apache 77. We're inbound. Mark enemy positions and hold on. The stunned reply came almost instantly, relief flooding the words. Apache 77. Thank God. We thought no one was coming. Ortiz looked at her and gave a grim smile. Well, Mara, looks like the rulebook just got torn up. She pushed the throttle forward, the Apache surging toward the smoke-filled valley. And with that, Captain Mara Kessler crossed the line from silence into history. The cockpit vibrated under the strain of sudden acceleration. The Apache's engines roared, rotors slicing the air, as if the machine itself understood what its pilot was about to do. Captain Mara Kessler felt her pulse match the rhythm of the blades. She knew the second she banked toward that valley, she wasn't just heading into combat, she was heading into judgment. Ortiz sat stiffly beside her, his gloved hands hovering over the weapon system's console. His eyes flicked between the tactical display and Mara's face, as if weighing two truths at once: the order they were breaking and the lives they were trying to save. "You realize what this means, right?" Ortiz said, his voice tight but calm. "When we land, Harding's going to throw the book at us. Stripped wings, court-martial, maybe worse." Mara didn't look at him. Her gaze was locked on the coordinates of Bravo Company, glowing like a beacon on her HUD. "And if we don't, there'll be body bags, not court records. Sometimes saving lives means breaking orders." Ortiz exhaled slowly, a mix of resignation and respect. He flipped a switch, arming the Hellfire missiles with an audible click. "Well, if we're going to burn our careers to the ground, we may as well do it properly." The Apache screamed forward, its nose dipping low as Mara skimmed the jagged ridgelines. Dust plumes rose in their wake, and every shadow in the terrain seemed to threaten an ambush. As they neared the valley, the radio came alive with gunfire reports and the frantic shouts of Bravo Company. "Apache 7-7, they've got us pinned on three sides. We can't move. Repeat, we cannot move." Mara's hands tightened on the cyclic. Through her targeting sensors, she saw flashes of muzzle fire on the ridges, streams of tracer rounds cutting through the dusk. Below the valley floor was a death trap. 20 American soldiers crouched behind rocks, some already wounded, surrounded by nearly 200 Taliban fighters. Ortiz's voice sharpened. "Mara, look at that tactical feed. Enemy reinforcements are flooding in from the West Pass. By the time we're overhead, they'll have 300. Mara's throat felt dry, but her voice was steady. "Then we hit them before they can close." The first wave of machine gun fire lanced toward them as they descended into the kill zone. Mara dropped the Apache lower, weaving between ridgelines, forcing the enemy to overshoot their aim. The cockpit shuddered with near misses, the acrid smell of gunpowder mixing with the metallic tang of the Apache's hydraulics. "Targets locked," Ortiz announced. "We've got multiple firing positions north ridge, mortars on the west." Mara's finger hovered over the trigger. "Engage. Make it count." The chain gun thundered to life, spitting fire across the rocks. Enemy fighters scattered as 30mm rounds chewed through their positions. Mortars that had been pounding Bravo Company seconds earlier went silent under precise Hellfire strikes. The valley erupted in smoke and shockwaves, the ground trembling under the weight of the Apache's fury. But every strike only revealed more enemy fire. Reinforcements poured down the slopes, emboldened by numbers. The radio crackled again. Bravo Company's commander, voice ragged but alive. "Apache 7-7, you're the only thing keeping us breathing. If you pull back, we're finished." Mara swallowed hard. "Then we don't pull back." For an officer, no training prepares you for this test. Orders are sacred, yet Mara stood between two impossible choices: obey and let 20 soldiers die, or disobey and sacrifice her career and honor. History shows the same. Hatu do you whack? Officers and Vietnam pilots who broke rules to save lives. Their reputations suffered, but their men survived. That is the burden of command. Sometimes honoring the uniform means daring to defy it. "Mara, we've got enemy movement south ridge," Ortiz barked, his tone cutting through her thoughts. "I see them," she replied, swinging the Apache hard left. She skimmed the canyon wall, diving low enough that the rotors nearly kissed the rock. Tracer fire streaked past, bright as comets. Her vision tunneled, her body fused with the machine, every decision distilled to instinct and precision. Her mind replayed Harding's words: "You can fly, but you will never fight." And here she was, fighting. Not because she wanted glory, but because she couldn't stomach the alternative: radio silence where men's lives should be. She glanced at Ortiz. "We keep them alive, no matter what it costs us." Ortiz gave a grim nod, his hands dancing across the weapons console. "Then let's show Harding what never fight looks like." The Apache banked once more, diving into the valley's heart, guns blazing, hellfires screaming, rotors shaking the sky itself. And in that moment, Mara Kessler wasn't just disobeying an order, she was redefining what it meant to serve. The valley thundered with chaos. Gunfire echoed from the ridges, ricocheting down into the narrow floor, where Bravo Company huddled behind rocks and shattered vehicles. Dust hung thick in the air, mingling with the cries of the wounded. Above it all came the roar of an Apache's rotors, Captain Mara Kessler's Apache, cutting across the sky like a predator unleashed. She lined up her first attack run. The 30mm M230 chain gun rumbled beneath her seat, each burst a controlled storm of fire. Through her sensors, Mara saw the glowing signatures of enemy fighters on the North Ridge, heavy machine gun nests that had been pouring rounds into Bravo Company. With a squeeze of her trigger, streams of 30mm shells tore through the rocks. Fighters toppled, their weapons silenced mid-burst. Dust plumed, smoke rose, and the ridgeline's murderous chorus faltered. "Direct hits," Ortiz confirmed from the co-pilot's seat, eyes glued to the display. "North Ridge fire is down." Below, the radio crackled with relief. "Apache 7-7, your fire's on target. We can breathe again." But Mara didn't slow. She banked hard left, sensors sweeping west. Mortar crews had been dropping rounds with terrifying accuracy, their arcs exploding dangerously close to the pinned soldiers. Left unchecked, they would finish Bravo Company before evacuation could ever arrive. "Hellfire solution locked," Ortiz said. Mara steadied the Apache, crosshairs painting the mortar team's position. Her thumb tapped the release. "Missile away." The AGM-114 Hellfire streaked downward, trailing smoke before detonating in a blinding flash. The mortar crew vanished in fire and dust. Seconds later, a second missile followed, obliterating a secondary position. "Mortars neutralized," Ortiz reported. "Bravo Company's got breathing room." The commander on the ground shouted over the net, "Apache 7-7, you just saved us. Mortar fire's gone. Moving to cover." For the first time, Mara allowed herself a breath. But only for a moment. Sensors lit up again, movement, dozens of heat signatures swarming like ants across the ridges. "South Ridge, East Ridge, multiple squads advancing," Ortiz warned. His tone had shifted from calm to urgent. "We're looking at..." "Mara, this isn't just 200. It's doubling. Reinforcements everywhere." Mara clenched her jaw. "Then we'll thin them out." She armed the Hydra 70 rockets, unguided but devastating against concentrations of fighters. Diving low, she unleashed a ripple of fire. Streaks of light trailed into the valley's edge, erupting into concussive blasts that ripped through enemy lines. Fighters scattered, some consumed by flame, others thrown to the ground by shockwaves. The valley floor shook. Smoke rose in thick columns, illuminated by flashes of explosions. Yet still they came. Waves of Taliban fighters pouring from cave mouths and hidden gullies, emboldened by sheer numbers. The count swelled past 400. Ortiz swore under his breath. "They're throwing everything at us." "Then they'll get everything we've got," Mara replied. What Mara did wasn't just brave, it was precise mastery. The Apache is deadly, but only as sharp as its pilot. While others leaned on combat hours, Mara sharpened herself through years of denial. Nights in simulators, drills repeated until instinct. Her accuracy was no accident. Every round surgical, every missile true. She flew as if her whole life had been preparing her for this moment, and in many ways it had. Bravo Company began shifting positions, using the lull created by Mara's strikes to regroup. The commander's voice came sharp through the radio. "Apache 7-7, we're moving. Keep the skies clear. We're counting on you." "Copy, Bravo," Mara answered. "Stay low and keep moving." Her display flashed again, heat signatures massing on the eastern ridge. Fighters with RPGs were setting up, preparing to ambush Bravo Company's escape route. Mara's mind raced. She had limited ammunition left, but those RPG teams could wipe out half the company in seconds if they fired. "Ortiz, priority targets East Ridge. Rockets first, then cannon cleanup." "Locked." Mara dipped the Apache, rockets screaming toward the ridge. The explosions tore through the enemy teams, scattering them before their launchers could fire. As survivors scrambled, Mara raked them with precise 30mm bursts, cutting down the threat before it could materialize. Ortiz exhaled. "Route's clear, for now." But the sensors told another story. Reinforcements were still pouring in, streams of fighters converging on the valley from all directions. The Taliban had realized they weren't just fighting Bravo Company anymore. They were fighting an Apache pilot who refused to yield. Mara's ammunition counter dwindled. Rockets, low. Hellfires, half gone. Cannon rounds, less than a third remaining. She knew she couldn't hold forever. And yet, looking at the valley below, soldiers limping, dragging wounded, trying to survive, she also knew pulling back wasn't an option. "Ortiz," she said quietly, eyes locked on the chaos. "As long as they're breathing, we fight." Ortiz gave a grim smile, nodding. "Then let's make every round count." And with that, Mara banked the Apache once more, diving back into the inferno. The valley was quieter now, but only by comparison. Smoke drifted through the air, black plumes rising where rockets and hellfires had struck. The ridgelines still crawled with enemy fighters, but their confidence had faltered under Mara Kessler's relentless fire. Even so, the situation was far from safe. Ortiz checked the ammunition counter, his voice grim. "Mara, we're nearly dry. 4 hellfires left, 200 rounds of cannon." Mara's eyes flicked over the displays. Not enough to wipe out hundreds of enemy fighters, but maybe enough to carve a path. "Then we don't waste a single shot," she said. "We use what we have to get them out." Below, Bravo Company's commander came through the radio, voice strained but steady. "Apache 7-7, we've got 20 souls here, 5 wounded. If you can keep the ridges off us for 15 minutes, we can reach a landing zone for medevac." Mara keyed her mic. "Copy, Bravo. You'll have your 15 minutes. Move when I say move." The Apache roared low over the valley, its shadow streaking across the rocks. Mara scanned the terrain, hunting for threats that could cut off Bravo's escape route. Enemy fighters were setting up along the eastern ridges, RPG teams preparing to ambush. "Priority targets, East Ridge," Ortiz called out. "Hellfires," Mara decided. She lined up the crosshairs, exhaled, and released. One missile streaked out, slamming into a cluster of fighters. A second followed, collapsing a ridgeline position in a spray of debris. The RPG threat vanished. "2 down, 2 left," Ortiz confirmed. "Save them," Mara ordered. "For whatever comes last." She banked again, rolling the Apache toward the southern slope. Enemy forces were massing, trying to close the escape corridor. Mara squeezed the trigger, the 30mm cannon spitting its last rounds. Dust and smoke exploded across the slope as fighters dove for cover. When the gun fell silent, her counter read less than 50 rounds. That silence pressed against them. For 2 hours they had unleashed hell from above. Now they were nearly empty, a predator stripped of its claws. But Mara didn't waver. She looked at Ortiz. "It's enough. It has to be." On her signal, Bravo Company began to move. Soldiers staggered from cover, dragging the wounded, rifles raised in shaking hands. Mara's Apache prowled above them, swooping low to scatter any enemy who dared to expose themselves. "Keep going," she urged over the radio. "We've got you covered." Gunfire flared from the western ridge. Dozens of enemy fighters trying to cut off the path. Ortiz snapped his gaze to the display. "We've got a problem. West side, heavy concentration." Mara's hand hovered over the missile trigger. 2 hellfires left. She fired one. The missile screamed across the valley, detonating in the center of the enemy formation. Fighters scattered, their advance broken. She saved the last missile, jaw clenched. Bravo Company pressed forward, boots pounding the rocky ground. One soldier fell, wounded, but his comrades lifted him without hesitation. Above them, Mara dipped the Apache so low that the rotor wash churned dust into a storm, obscuring Bravo's movement from enemy marksmen. Ortiz muttered, almost in disbelief, "She's using the helicopter itself as cover." It was unorthodox, dangerous, but effective. Every trick, every maneuver, every ounce of training came to bear in those minutes. Finally, the landing zone came into view. A rough patch of flattened earth, barely wide enough for a medevac bird. Smoke rose nearby, gunfire echoing off the ridges. The ground commander's voice crackled with urgency. "Apache 7-7, medevac inbound. We need 60 more seconds." "60 you'll have," Mara replied. She banked once more, spotting enemy fighters sprinting toward the LZ. She used her final hellfire, obliterating the lead squad in a blast that shook the valley. Out of missiles, Ortiz reported. Then we scare the rest. Mara angled the Apache low, swooping directly over the remaining fighters. The sheer presence of the gunship, rotors shrieking overhead, was enough to scatter them into cover. Moments later, the medevac helicopters descended, dust blasting across the LZ. Bravo Company poured in, lifting their wounded aboard. The last soldier stumbled in just as the medevacs lifted skyward. Apache 7-7, this is Bravo 6. The commander's voice came through, thick with gratitude. All 20 accounted for, not one lost. You brought us home. Mara closed her eyes briefly, a weight lifting from her chest. That's what we came for, she said quietly. In the military, medals often honor victories and destruction, but true leadership is preservation. With almost no ammunition and every reason to retreat, Mara stayed, not for glory, but to make sure every soldier lived. When the dust cleared, she had no trophies, only 20 men alive who would have been dead without her. And sometimes that is the only victory that matters. The desert sun had barely set when the Apache touched back down at the forward operating base. Dust swirled in the rotor wash as the engine powered down, and for the first time in hours, silence returned to Mara Kessler's world. She pulled off her helmet, sweat streaking her face, exhaustion cutting deep into her features. Around her, mechanics and crew members rushed forward, not with their usual efficiency, but with stunned awe. They had heard the radio traffic. They knew what she had just done. But before anyone could speak, a runner approached with stiff urgency. Captain Kessler, Colonel Harding wants you in the command office. Now. The words were not unexpected. Mara handed off her helmet, exchanged a quick glance with Ortiz, and walked toward the building where judgment awaited. Inside the command office, Colonel Harding stood behind his desk, arms folded, jaw set like stone. His voice cracked the air the moment she entered. You violated a direct order, Captain. You left your patrol route, engaged in unauthorized combat, and disobeyed standing policy. Do you understand the gravity of that? Mara stood at attention, shoulders squared. Yes, sir. Then you also understand the consequences, Harding pressed. His eyes burned with the authority of a man who believed discipline was the spine of the military. Without discipline, there is no order. Without order, there is no army. You risked everything. For what? To prove a point? Mara's voice was calm but steady. No, sir. To save lives. On Harding's desk lay the freshly printed after-action report, pages of tactical analysis, eyewitness accounts, and casualty tallies. Harding flipped through it, his scowl deepening, until finally he read aloud. Enemy fighters eliminated, 150 plus. Friendly casualties, 0. The silence that followed was heavier than any accusation. Mara held his gaze, refusing to flinch. Harding closed the folder slowly. The results are undeniable, but results don't erase insubordination. This is the soldier's eternal conflict, obedience versus conscience. Armies run on orders, but history honors those who chose humanity over rules. Harding stood for the institution, rigid, unyielding. Mara stood for duty itself, protecting lives even at her own cost. It wasn't just a mission, it was a question of loyalty, to command or to those you swear to defend. Harding finally broke the silence. You've made me choose between my principles and your record. You've humiliated my authority, Captain. I should ground you permanently. Ortiz, who had been silent until now, stepped forward. With respect, sir, you'd be grounding the best pilot I've ever flown with. If she hadn't broken orders, 20 Americans would be dead right now. That's not defiance, that's duty. Harding's jaw worked. His eyes flicked between Ortiz and Mara. Then he leaned forward, voice low. Do you understand what happens if every soldier decides their judgment is better than their orders? The whole system collapses. Mara answered simply, Sometimes, sir, the system needs to be reminded what it exists for. For a long time, Harding said nothing. The office was thick with tension, the clash of tradition against change. At last, he closed the report and set it aside. Your case is being sent up the chain, he said curtly. Until then, you're confined to base. No flights, no missions. Dismissed. Mara saluted, turned sharply, and walked out. She had no illusions. Her career might well be over, but as she stepped back into the night air, She heard the distant sound of Bravo Company celebrating their survival. 20 voices laughing, alive because she had refused to obey silence. And for Mara, that sound was worth more than any medal. 1 month later, the ripple of a single decision had reached the highest levels of command. Reports were reviewed, testimonies collected, and analysts pored over the numbers from the Valley Rescue. The facts could not be ignored. 150 enemy fighters eliminated, 0 American deaths, 20 soldiers brought home alive, all achieved by a pilot who, according to standing policy, should never have been allowed to fight at all. The debate inside the Pentagon was fierce. Traditionalists argued that if one officer was excused for disobedience, discipline across the Army might fracture. But others asked the harder question: what good is discipline if it kills the very people it exists to protect? The report from Colonel Harding's base had become more than a battlefield summary. It was a case study forcing the military to look itself in the mirror. And then the change came. Quietly at first in memos and signatures, but its meaning was seismic. The combat restrictions on female Apache pilots were lifted. Captain Mara Kessler was officially cleared for unrestricted combat missions. Her name appeared on the roster without asterisks or caveats for the first time. She had not only saved 20 lives, she had shifted the boundaries of what women in uniform were allowed to do. For her, it wasn't triumph in the cinematic sense. There was no parade, no medal pinned to her chest in front of cameras. But there was something deeper. The quiet recognition that the ceiling above her had cracked, and others would now fly through the space she had torn open. Mara's victory was part of a larger story, one written across generations. In World War II, women had served as nurses, code breakers, and pilots in the Women Air Force Service Pilots (WASP) program, yet most were denied combat recognition. In Vietnam, female medics often stood unarmed in fire-swept zones, saving lives under conditions that blurred the line between support and combat. And in 2003, long after Mara's fictionalized war, the real U.S. military formally lifted the ban on women serving in direct ground combat roles. Each step forward had been paved by someone who refused to accept the limits imposed on them. Mara, in this story, stood in that lineage, not as the first and not the last, but as one more name in a chain of defiance and duty. Colonel Harding never admitted he was wrong, but he no longer needed to. The numbers had spoken louder than tradition, and the Army had been forced to listen. Ortiz, when asked later about the mission, summed it up simply. She didn't save them because she was a woman. She saved them because she was the best pilot in the sky that day. Mara herself never sought the spotlight. When pressed by reporters, she said only, "I did what I was trained to do, protect lives." But in the silence after, she carried the weight of knowing that what she had done would outlive her career. Because change rarely begins with permission. Sometimes the future is written by those who refuse to wait for permission. In the end, Captain Mara Kessler's story is more than a tale of combat. It's a mirror for our own lives. In today's America, many of us face rules, expectations, or stereotypes that try to tell us what we can't do. Mara's decision reminds us that real leadership isn't about medals or titles. It's about courage, responsibility, and bringing others home safe. For older generations watching, perhaps you've lived through moments when standing up for what was right cost you something, but also gave life or hope to someone else. For younger viewers, maybe this is a reminder that the future doesn't always wait for permission. So here's the question I'll leave with you. When should we follow the rules? And when should we have the courage to break them for something greater? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments.